are on page 51A, and the Gemara that we're learning was dealing with the laws of doing using food for other purposes than eating, and then the Gemara got involved with the question of what happens if you put something in your mouth and you realize you didn't recite a bracha before you ate it. And so the Gemara had said that it really depends. And it depends on if it's a liquid. If it's a liquid, then you just swallow it. If it was a solid, so then if it's something that does not get mius, does not get disgusting, then a person would spit it out and then recite the bracha and eat it. And if it is something that does get disgusting, a person would push it to the side of his mouth and recite the bracha properly and then eat it and then swallow it. Now the Gemara has just mentioned those three points, and then it says, well, why do you need to spit it out? Why don't you just, even if it's not disgusting, just push it to the side of your mouth? And this is the Gemara's question on page 51A, the top of page 51A. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, but we don't see you.
Okay. Oh, you don't see me? Because I'm looking at the. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the screen, and I guess it won't allow me. You know what?
One or the other. But keep talking. It's okay. We know where you are.
Okay, very good. Okay, so the Gemara on the top of the page. I'm going to read it inside. So the Gemara says that b'midi delay mimis nami l'salkinu l'tzad echad v'levarich. Something that's not disgusting, let us push it to the side and recite the bracha on that as well. In Tirgum Rav Yitzchok Kaskesa, Kamed Rabbi Yosi Bar Avin, Shmeid Rabbi Yochanan, that this rabbi explained the reason why you really should spit it out is because Mishum Shenemar Yimali Piti Lasecha, my mouth is filled with your praise. That means that nothing else should be in my mouth when I am praising you and reciting a bracha. And therefore, the ideal thing is to not have anything in your mouth, and only in a case where it's going to get disgusting, that's when we would say that you would spit it out. That's where we could say if it's something that's going to get disgusting, we're going to say that, in that case, you have no other choice, so you push it to the side. But really, the ideal is to spit it out because you don't want to have anything in your mouth when you're reciting a bracha. Ba'u minei Rav Chizda. So they asked a question from Rav Chizda. Mi sha'achal b'shasa v'loy berach. A person who ate and drank and he forgot to say a bracha. Mahu sheyachzor v'yavarich. So he's asking a question. The person forgot to say a bracha, and he's wondering, should he now say the bracha after the fact that he ate? Now, it's a very hard to, this Gemara, there are different ways of learning it, because it is a little hard to understand what are the thoughts involved. In other words, we like to try to figure out what the question of the Gemara is, what was the Gemara thinking, what's the Gemara answering, and what's it changing, and the answer. So the question sounds a little surprising, because you ate a meal, and you didn't say a bracha, and now after the fact you want to say a bracha, after you finished your meal, and you're going to say the bracha now, and the Gemara is asking that maybe you should. They asked Rav Chizda, maybe you should say a bracha. So Amar Lahu, so he answered back, Misha Achal Shum Berechai Noidei. If a person ate garlic and he's got bad smell, he's got a bad breath, the smell is spreading of the garlic. Yachzer v'yochel shum acher. He should go and eat more shum, other garlic, kadei sheyehei reichai noidik. So he'll have more bad breath. They'll have more. The smell will spread more. Meaning, what that means is that if you did a sin once, in other words, you ate without a bracha, should you go and do another sin, which is reciting a bracha in vain? So this is one way of learning the Gemara. That the Gemara's question was that maybe after the fact, maybe you should say a bracha, and the Gemara's answer is that after the fact, it's too late, and it would be, just 1 second. I see Isaac is trying to get in. Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, yeah, every so often I got to go back and make sure.
Yeah, that's fine.
Everyone's in. Okay, so the bottom line is that the way we're learning the Gemara, the first way we're learning the Gemara is the Gemara is thinking that maybe you could recite a bracha after you ate. Obviously, you're going to recite an after bracha. The Gemara is thinking maybe you could even recite a bracha, the first bracha. You're also going to recite now after the fact that you ate because you missed out. So maybe you could recite a bracha. And Rav Chisda says, what do you mean? If you do one sin, you should do a second sin? The first sin you did was you ate without a bracha. The second sin would be that you are going to say God's name in vain by saying a bracha without eating. So the question really is on this explanation of the Gemara, what was the Gemara thinking in the first place? That you could say a bracha and not eat, a first bracha and not eat? It just seems surprising that it seems surprising that there would be such a thought in the Gemara that you could do such a thing. Yes, Ezra.
So let's say that you started and you realized that you forgot to say bracha. So can you say bracha, eat some more with in mind, with the fact that whatever you had before in mind?
So this is another way of learning the Gemara. Very good, Ezra. You've come up. There is an alternative way of learning the Gemara, and that way is it's along the same lines as what you're saying. And that's what, let me read it inside with that explanation. So the other way of reading the Gemara is that the Gemara says that you're in the middle of eating. And they asked Rav Chisda, Rav Chisda, we're going to go back now. We're now 5 lines from the top. They asked Rav Chisda, if a person ate and drank, and he didn't recite a bracha beforehand, but he's still in the middle of his meal. Should he go and recite a bracha now should he recite a bracha now? Now, on a simple level, what that means is the Gemara is asking, could he say a bracha now if did he already miss out, and is it too late? So Rav Chisda answers. Rav Chisda answers that. What do you mean? If someone ate someone ate garlic, did one sin, he should do another sin. In other words, you didn't say a bracha beforehand. Now you're going to do another sin and eat more. You're going to eat more garlic. You're going to eat more and not say a bracha. Now, the problem with that explanation is that's really hard to understand. What were we thinking in the first place? That if you missed out in a bracha, you started eating an apple, you missed out in the bracha, you forgot it, and now you're in the middle of eating the apple. You think that you're not going to have to recite a bracha now for the second half of the apple? Like what really? I mean, this is really hard to understand. Why you would not say a bracha? So one of the commentaries wants to explain along this path, which is that it follows Ezra's thought. And the question, the way the Gemara is thinking is, can you have in mind also for the bracha that you missed out on? So in other words, you're reciting a bracha on the food that you're going to eat. Can you also have in mind for the food that you missed out a bracha on? can this bracha go on that food as well? And that's the way, according to this explanation, you could learn the Gemara. So the problem with this explanation is I don't know how to really fit in the answer, because the Gemara's answer is someone who ate garlic, should he eat more garlic? And what that means is that if you made one sin, should you do another sin? But here, if you're learning the Gemara this way, he's not doing a sin. It's just questioning. The question is if he can have in mind the food that he ate before. Can he also have it in mind, and will the bracha also affect it? And somehow you have to say that what the Gemara is answering is that doing the bracha later, it's like you can't do anything to fix the garlic smell. The garlic smell that you had already is, what you had already is it's over. It's done and over. And something along the lines that maybe the bracha doesn't help. You can't really say a bracha on something from the past, but it will work for the future. That's what it would seem like the Gemara is answering. Anyway, the Gemara then continues with a very similar discussion. And Amar Ravina, so we're now 7 lines from the top of the page, or 8 lines down from the top of the page. And the Gemara says, let me just see if anyone else is trying to get in. So the Gemara says, Amar Ravina, Ravina says, Hilkach, therefore, Afilu Gamar also, even if a person finishes his meal, Yachzor v'yavari, he should go and recite the bracha. So here, Ravina seems to be saying along the same lines as the previous questioner. The person who asked the question had thought this idea as well, at least according to the first explanation that I gave, that if a person can a person recite a bracha? Can a person recite a bracha after he finished eating if he forgot originally to say the bracha? And here Ravina seems to be saying the same thing, that it even says hilkach, therefore, which is very surprising. What is the therefore? We just concluded that you can't say a bracha. So Ravina then says, therefore, even if a person finished his meal, he could go and say a bracha. It seems a little surprising that he uses the word hilkach. So Rashi says that hilkach means since if he remembered in the middle of the meal, he could say a bracha. So even at the end of the meal, maybe he also should say a bracha, which it seems to be one of the commentaries wants to say that Rashi must have had a text where this Gemara is really following the previous Gemara that we mentioned on the end of page 50b. And the Gemara over there concluded, and we just finished on the top of 51a, that a person should recite a bracha after it's in their mouth already. There is still an obligation of the bracha. And so the way Rashi is learning is this Gemara is going on that. Therefore, since we see that if a person remembered, even if it's in his mouth, he remembers in the middle, meaning it's in his mouth already, and he still has to say a bracha. So the same law should apply if he finished the meal. He should also say a bracha. So the hilkach, which means therefore, is going back on that Gemara. Not going back on Rav Chizda's statement. It's really going back on the earlier Gemara, where we find that the person has food in their mouth and they still recite a bracha. So this implied to Ravina that maybe you should still have to say a bracha even if you finish the meal. Now, this is following the first explanation that I gave, that Rav Chizda's case is a case where he finished the meal already, and Rav Chizda said, of course, you cannot say a bracha, and Ravina is going on the earlier Gemara, and he has that same thought that maybe you could say a bracha, and he's basing it on the fact that you have the food in your mouth and you say a bracha, even though the food is already in your mouth, and therefore he's thinking that this would be a source. And he brings also another source as well. Now, according to the other ways of learning the Gemara, the understanding of Ravina is that if you're in the middle of the meal and you say a bracha, he thought that gives room to say that maybe even after you finish, you should say a bracha. And this is following Rav Chisda's point. In other words, the Gemara just finished off saying that according to that Rav Chisda says that if you're in the middle of a meal, you do have to say a bracha on the future food. So if you do have to say a bracha on the future food in the middle of the meal, it leads us to think that maybe even after you finished eating, maybe you would still recite a bracha. So these are the different ways of learning the Gemara. And the source of Ravina has a brisa that he wants to use as a proof to his point, which of course the Gemara is going to prove wrong afterwards. But his point is that Ravina says, even if you finish the su'uda, the meal, yachzer v'yavareh, you should say a bracha even afterwards. The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, taval v'ola, if a person went to the mikvah and he came up from the mikvah, oimer bali yasoi, when he gets up from the mikvah, he should say, Baruch asher kiddushanu b'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu al hatfilah. When he leaves the mikvah, he says that bracha when he gets out of the mikvah. Now, he says this bracha. So what do you see from there? That you don't say the bracha before you dunk, you say the bracha after you dunk. Now, what type of dunking are we talking about? What mitzvah of mikvah are we referring to? So Rashi says, what we're talking about is, we're talking about someone who's a Baal Keri. And a Baal Keri, it means he had a seminal emission, and because of that, he's not supposed to say a bracha until he goes to the mikvah. And because he's not supposed to say a bracha until he goes to the mikvah, so how does he recite the bracha on the dunking? So therefore, he says the bracha after he dunks in the mikvah. So you see that there are brachas that you recite after, even though normally brachas are recited before. It's called Oiver La'asiyasan. A bracha is supposed to be recited before the mitzvah is done. Nevertheless, of course, when you put up a mezuzah, you say the bracha before you put the mezuzah up. Before you put tefillin on, you say the bracha on it. Before all the mitzvahs, you say the bracha before. The only bracha that you don't say before that we know of is really lighting Shabbos candles. Because if you light them after you say the bracha, it would be a problem of accepting Shabbos and then lighting the candles. So we light the candles first, and then we recite the bracha. But the
when you go to the bathroom too.
Right. Well, okay. That's a bracha of thanks. But on mitzvahs, right, brachas of thanks would make sense that you could say thank you afterwards. But the bracha of mitzvahs would be a bracha that you're supposed to do over las yasser. And so because of that, this is the law should apply to mikvah, that you should also recite the bracha really beforehand. However, because it's a Baal Keri and he's not allowed to say brachas, again, I should emphasize that nowadays the law of Baal Keri is more lenient because the rabbis saw that it wasn't a decree that was able to be accepted by everyone, and therefore it was to some extent abolished. I mean, some people still go to mikvah, but it's not that you can't learn Torah or daven. Or some opinions say you can learn Torah, but you can't daven. But the common understanding is that you can daven and you can say brachas and you can learn Torah even without going to the mikvah, even though it's maybe it would be advisable to go to the mikvah. So but in the olden days, you weren't allowed to say a bracha before the rabbis abolished the decree. and therefore you weren't allowed to say bracha. Therefore, the bracha on tefillah was a bracha that was recited afterwards. So Ravina wants to say, based on that, the same thing is with food. Food is also something that should be recited. The bracha should be recited beforehand. But since you missed out. And since we find other cases where you missed out, you still say it afterwards. If the food is in your mouth, you still say it. If you go to mikvah, if Baal Keri goes to mikvah, he says the bracha afterwards. So you see that there is such a concept of reciting a bracha afterwards. So the Gemara concludes and says that it's Velohi. This is not so. It's not a very good comparison, because there, over there, the person was not fit to say a bracha. He couldn't. Here, the person could have. He should have. He should have said the bracha. He should have remembered to say a bracha. And since it was pushed off, in other words, he missed out in the bracha. It's pushed off. You can't say it. So, Ravina, you want to claim that a person should be able to recite a bracha after you missed out after you missed out in your bracha, you want to say you should say it now. It's not a good comparison from mikvah. So Rashi over here says that the majority of tefillos are Baal Keris, and they are prohibited from saying brachas, and therefore the Gemara mentions this idea. Now Tosfos actually has another explanation. He says that where do you find a tummy person not allowed to make a bracha? He says Rashi says they're talking about a Baal Keri, who's also in Divrei Torah, but Tosfos says you could say that it's talking about a ger that goes to mikvah, because when a ger goes to mikvah, he can't recite the bracha beforehand, and because he's not Jewish. So therefore, he recites it afterwards. And Tosfos adds this interesting point. He says that because by a ger they do the bracha afterwards. So the rabbis established that the bracha on mikvah, you always recite that bracha afterwards. And Tosfos says, and the same thing applies to netilas yadayim, when you wash your hands. That a person comes from, sometimes a person comes from, if he comes out of the bathroom and he wants to wash for bread, so he would need to do he's not fit to say the bracha before he washes his hands for bread. Therefore, he would wash his hands, including the washing of his hands from the bathroom he's washing for the bread, and he has to recite the bracha then afterwards, because he can't say it beforehand because his hands are still dirty. And because of that case, the custom is that everyone who washes their hands for bread, they first wash their hands, and only afterwards do they say the bracha on the netilas. Only afterwards you say the bracha on netilas yadayim. So you have this idea where you're really supposed to say a bracha first, but because you're not able to say the bracha first in one scenario. Let's say a person came out of the bathroom, they can't say the bracha before washing their hands. So therefore, because of that scenario, we basically have a rule that all washings of the hands, you say the bracha after you wash, you actually pour the water on your hand. So that would be another scenario where we are accustomed to actually say the bracha after the mitzvah. But of course, we wash our hands, but we don't dry them until after the bracha. But the concept you see there of doing part of the mitzvah before you say the bracha. So this is how Tosfos is learning that it's referring to the tevilah of a ger, and because of that, it applies to all tevilas, all dunkings in the mikvah. It's always done. The bracha is always done afterwards. Okay, so this is the This is basically this rule of a person forgetting to recite a bracha, and if you're going to continue eating, of course, you do have to say another bracha on the food that you're going to eat. But the food that you ate already, you can't say a bracha on that food. It's basically too late. You missed out. The next Gemara, it jumps to more of some interesting medical stuff that it seems to either medical stuff or it has some idea, some element of. We're gonna come to Gemaras that also deal with more mystical issues or issues of dangers, things that are dangerous because of demons or the angel of death, things like that. So we're jumping now from halachic rulings to more health issues. So the Gemara says here by the two dots, where it must be about 12 lines down from the top of the page. Tano Rabbanan, the rabbi said, asparagus, which does not mean asparagus. Asparagus is some type of either wine or beer that's mixed with some cabbage liquid. It was drank. Rashi tells us it was customary to drink this in the morning on an empty stomach, and it was healthy. So this asparagus is yafel alev, b'toiv la'einayim. It's good for the heart. It's good for the eyes. The kol shkein livnei ma'ayim, and for sure it's very good for the intestines. But haragel by, and a person who drinks it often, yafel l'chol gufay. It's good for their whole body. But if a person gets drunk from it, a person gets shikar, gets drunk, kasha l'chol gufay, it's bad for his whole body. So the Gemara says, Midiktani yafel alev. Since we learned that it's good for the heart. You need to stand here. You can't stand. So the Gemara says, "Haragel by yafel l'chol gufa." Okay. So Miditani yafel alev. Since the Gemara says that this is good for the heart, mechlal de b'chamra askinon. It must mean that we're talking about the asparagus that's made from wine.
It's made with,
also
it's made
asparagus.
with, not from, but it says it's made with wine.
I'm sorry?
It says it's made with wine, not from wine. Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So it's made with wine, and there is another type that's made with beer.
Okay.
And so the Gemara says that this one that we're talking about must be the one. The one that we're talking about must be the one that's made with the wine, and it says uktani, and it says the kol shkein livnei ma'ayim, that it's for sure good for the intestines. So the Gemara asks, that can't be. V'hatanya, didn't we learn in a brisa, lila'at yafeh, l'ramat kasha? It's good for la'at and it's bad for ramat. What is la'at and what's ramat? La'at is a acronym for leiv, ayin, and tchoil. The heart, the eyes, and the spleen. Ramat stands for the Roish. One second. The Roish is the Reish is the Roish. Ma'ayim and Tachtoinios. So Ramat it means it's bad for the head, the intestines, and for hemorrhoids. Those are the three things it's bad for. So it's good for the la'at, the heart, the eye, and the spleen, and it's bad for the intestines and the head and hemorrhoids. So how did the first statement that we brought, the Tanu Rabbanon, how did it say kol shkein livnei mayim? For sure, it's good for the intestines. If it's really not good, it's bad for the intestines if it's made from the wine, or with wine. So so the Gemara says, Ki Tanya Hahi b'meyushan. When did we learn that, Brisa? We're talking about aged wine. We're not 3 years old. If it's aged, then it's actually good for the intestines. And we have a proof that aged wine falls into a different category than other wine. Kidetnan, as we learned in a Mishnah, koinem yayin shani toyim. Koinem is a term used when a person makes a vow. He says the word koinem, which is like a slang for a korban. It should be prohibited like a sacrifice on me. The wine, sha'ani tayim, wine that I'm going to drink. So he's prohibiting wine from benefiting from any wine. That's what he's saying. I'm prohibiting wine from me. Kainam yayin sha'ani tayim. That's the Aramaic term for making a vow against wine. Shahayayin kashel of neima'ayim. And he said a reason, why am I vowing against making a vow against wine? Because wine is bad for my intestines. So what that means is that he made a promise. He doesn't want to drink wine, and he doesn't have enough self-motivation to stop himself from drinking the wine. So what does he do? Instead, what he does is he makes a vow. If he makes a vow, the vow will give him that extra force that he'll control himself. So he'll have self-control because he made a vow. He's not going to transgress his vow. So therefore, he makes a vow that he's not going to have wine because it's bad for his intestines. So the thing is that they told him, but isn't meyushan, the miyushan, which is aged wine, that's good for the intestines. The shasak, and he was quiet. So the law is asur b'chadash umutter b'miyushan. So the law is, in the laws of vows, that in this scenario he is prohibited in having new wine, but he ends up being permitted to have aged wine. And the reason he's prohibited in the new wine is he made a vow, but he's permitted in the aged wine because the aged wine was not part of his vow, even though he said the vow on wine. He didn't say aged wine or non-aged wine, but because he gave a reason for his vow, or his logic behind his vow was that it was unhealthy, and really aged wine is healthy. Therefore, it is not a problem for him to drink the aged wine, and it wasn't included in his vow. Now, there's many different laws to vows, and there is an interesting law about vows that once a neder is kutar mitzasai, once part of the vow is invalid, so the entire vow becomes invalid. And that would mean that once the wine, he made a vow against wine, but he didn't specify new wine. And because he didn't specify it, it's actually his reason behind it doesn't apply to the aged wine. Therefore, it turns out that his vow is not fully valid because aged wine is actually healthy for him. Now, once it becomes invalid for the aged wine, the vow is also invalid, seemingly, for the new wine as well, because it's called a neder that part of it becomes abolished, the entire vow becomes void. It voids the entire vow. So the question is, what does the Gemara mean that the that the aged wine is permitted, but the new wine is not is prohibited. Why should that be? So that's why there is a gimel over there that takes you to the side, and on the side you have this a change of the text where he wants to say that it's maybe you don't read that it's prohibited for new wine. That maybe it should be permitted. Maybe that's also permitted, but the other way of reading it follows there are some it is a little confusing, but there are different laws about how it works. When it depends also what he answers when they tell him that wine. Here it says he was quiet when they told him that the wine is good for the aged wine is good for you. Here it says he was quiet. Now it depends what he answers. If he would have answered that something to the effect of that that the aged wine is he didn't have it in mind, or something that if he didn't realize, if he says something, it depends on what he answers, will cause the entire. In other words, not always is the entire vow invalid. So because he was quiet, that would be a reason why the other half of the vow is valid. So that would be the reason to have the text that it's prohibited in new wine, but he is permitted in old wine. So that's basically this Gemara about
Rabbi,
the difference between old aged wine and new